By the early months of 1945, Germany was no longer fighting to win the war, it was fighting to survive its final weeks. Cities lay in ruins after years of relentless bombing, railways were shattered, and supplies of food and fuel were running dangerously low. Yet for millions of ordinary civilians, daily life continued in a strange, suspended reality. Shops still opened when they could, children still attended school when buildings remained standing, and local officials continued to enforce rules from a government that was already collapsing. On maps, the situation was unmistakable. From the east, the Red Army was advancing rapidly after launching the massive Vistula-Oder offensive, pushing deep into German territory in a matter of weeks. Entire regions that had once felt distant from the front lines were suddenly within reach of Soviet artillery. Refugees flooded westward, carrying stories of destruction, fear, and revenge. Their accounts spread panic in towns that had not yet seen a single enemy soldier. From the west, Allied, British, and Allied forces were pressing forward just as relentlessly. After breaking through German defenses following the Battle of the Bulge, Allied armies crossed into Germany itself. Their advance was methodical but unstoppable. Roads filled with military convoys, columns of tanks, trucks, and artillery stretching for miles. Overhead, Allied aircraft dominated the skies, making daytime movement increasingly dangerous. For civilians inside Germany, the war began to feel like something both distant and suddenly very close. Official broadcasts insisted that victory was still possible, that new weapons would turn the tide, that loyalty and sacrifice would save the nation. The voice of Joseph Goebbels continued to echo through radios, urging total resistance. Posters appeared on walls calling for courage, while newspapers reported victories that no one could verify. But reality was harder to ignore with each passing day. Bomb sirens wailed more frequently, sometimes multiple times a night. Families crowded into basements and air raid shelters, waiting in darkness as the ground shook above them. When they emerged, they often found entire streets reduced to rubble. In cities like Cologne and Dresden, destruction had already reached a scale that seemed unimaginable just a year earlier. In smaller towns far from major industrial targets, life seemed calmer on the surface. There were fewer bombings, fewer visible signs of war, but even here the tension was constant. Young men were gone, sent to the front, many never to return. Elderly men and teenage boys were now being called up into the Volkssturm, a last-ditch militia formed to defend the homeland. They were often poorly trained, sometimes barely armed, and yet expected to stop experienced Allied soldiers. Rumors became a kind of currency. People whispered about advancing armies, about entire cities falling overnight, about neighbors who had disappeared after criticizing the regime. Listening to foreign radio broadcasts was forbidden, but many still did so in secret, risking severe punishment just to hear a version of the war that sounded closer to the truth. In this atmosphere, uncertainty shaped every decision. Should families flee west, hoping to avoid the Soviets, or stay, trusting that their town might be spared? Should local officials prepare to surrender or continue to resist in fear of being accused of treason? No one knew which choice was safer. As winter turned to spring, the signs of collapse became impossible to hide. Military units moved through towns in disorganized groups, retreating rather than advancing. Vehicles broke down for lack of fuel. Soldiers, exhausted and disillusioned, spoke more openly about defeat. Some quietly discarded their uniforms, trying to disappear before the war reached its end. And yet, in many places, there was still no direct contact with the enemy, no gunfire in the streets, no tanks on the horizon, just silence, broken by distant explosions and the constant hum of uncertainty. It was this silence that made what came next so shocking. Because in the final weeks of the war, the front line did not always arrive gradually. There were no long battles, no warnings, no time to prepare. Instead, it moved with a speed that defied expectations. Entire regions were bypassed, surrounded, and cut off almost without resistance. For many German towns, the war would end not with a final stand or a dramatic battle. It would end in a way that felt almost unreal. One evening, everything would seem unchanged, Nazi flags still hanging, officials still in charge, the illusion of control still intact. And by morning, everything would be different. By March 1945, the war in Western Germany had reached a point where a single natural barrier stood between the Allied armies and the heart of the country, the Rhine River. For centuries, the Rhine had been more than just a river. It was a symbol of German strength, a defensive line that generals believed could slow or even stop an invading force. Bridges across it had been carefully prepared for demolition, and the expectation was clear. If the Allies reached the Rhine, they would be held there. But war rarely follows expectations. On March 7, 1945, units of the United States Army approached the town of Remagen. What they found there was something almost unbelievable. The Ludendorff Bridge was still standing. German forces had planned to destroy every crossing over the Rhine to slow the Allied advance. Explosives had been placed, wires connected, orders given, and yet, due to confusion, miscommunication, and the rapid pace of the Allied push, the bridge had not yet been successfully demolished. Some charges had failed, others had not been detonated in time. American troops hesitated only briefly. They understood immediately what this meant. A bridge intact across the Rhine was not just an opportunity, it was a turning point. Under fire from German defenders, U.S. soldiers rushed forward. Machine guns opened up, artillery shells landed nearby, and the bridge itself was damaged and unstable. At any moment it could collapse into the river below. Still, they advanced. Step by step, across steel beams and damaged planks, they crossed to the eastern bank. Behind them, engineers worked frantically to keep the bridge standing. German forces attempted to destroy it with everything they had left: artillery strikes, aerial bombing, even frogmen sent to plant explosives. None of it worked in time. The bridge held long enough. Within hours, more troops began crossing. Then tanks, then entire divisions. What had started as a risky gamble became a full-scale breakthrough. The Allies had secured a foothold on the eastern side of the Rhine, something German command had believed would take weeks, if not months. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. News of the bridge at Remagen spread quickly through German military channels. Officers understood what it meant. The last major natural defense in the West had been breached. There would be no stable line to regroup behind, no time to reorganize. Adolf Hitler reacted with fury. Executions were ordered for officers blamed for failing to destroy the bridge. Panic spread within the German high command as the realization set in that control over the Western Front was slipping away faster than anyone had anticipated. For civilians living near the Rhine, the change was sudden and deeply unsettling. Just days earlier, the river had represented safety, a barrier between them and the advancing enemy. Now that illusion was gone. The war was no longer approaching, it had crossed over. American forces moved quickly to expand the bridgehead. More crossings were established along the river, both north and south of Remagen. Pontoon bridges were constructed, allowing a steady flow of men and vehicles into the German interior. The sound of engines, once distant, grew louder with each passing day. For many towns, there was still no direct contact with Allied troops, but something had shifted. The rhythm of the war had changed. German units were no longer moving forward, they were falling back, often in disorganized and chaotic ways. Columns of soldiers passed through villages heading east, tired, silent, and no longer speaking of victory. At the same time, Allied air superiority made any large-scale movement dangerous. Roads became targets, railways were unusable, communication broke down, orders arrived late or not at all. In many areas, local commanders were left to make decisions on their own, often without clear guidance. Rumors once again filled the silence. People spoke of the Rhine being crossed, of American tanks already deep inside Germany, of entire regions being cut off. Some refused to believe it, clinging to official reports that still promised resistance and eventual success. Others began to quietly prepare for what seemed inevitable. White cloth started to appear in some homes, hidden away, ready to be hung from windows when the time came. It was a small act, but a meaningful one, a silent acknowledgement that the end might arrive not with orders, but suddenly, without warning. Because what made this moment so powerful was not just the military breakthrough, but the speed that followed it. The crossing at Remagen did not lead to a slow, grinding advance. It opened the door to something much faster. With the Rhine behind them, American forces were no longer constrained by natural barriers. They could move freely, choosing speed over caution, pushing deep into territory that had never seen enemy soldiers so soon. And as they moved, they did not always stop. They bypassed strong points, avoided unnecessary battles, and advanced along multiple routes at once. This created a strange and unsettling effect. Some towns were captured quickly, others were simply passed by, and some found themselves in a situation that no one had planned for. Cut off, surrounded, left behind as the front line moved far beyond them. For the civilians inside those towns, there would be no dramatic announcement, no clear signal that everything had changed. The war would not arrive step by step. It would arrive all at once. After the Rhine had been crossed, the nature of the war in Western Germany changed almost overnight. What had once been a slow, grinding advance turned into something far more fluid and unpredictable. The Allied armies no longer needed to pause and regroup. There were no major natural barriers left, no clear defensive lines that could be held for long. Instead, the battlefield opened wide, and into that space the advance accelerated. At the center of this rapid movement was the 3rd United States Army under the command of George S. Patton. Known for his aggressive tactics and relentless pace, Patton pushed his forces forward with a single priority: speed. He understood that the German army was no longer capable of mounting a coordinated defense, and that the faster his troops moved, the less chance the enemy would have to reorganize. Columns of American tanks and armored vehicles surged eastward and northward, often covering distances in a single day that would have taken weeks earlier in the war. The M4 Sherman became a common sight on German roads, its engines rumbling through villages that had never expected to see foreign soldiers so soon. Alongside them came trucks loaded with infantry, artillery units, and engineers, all moving in a continuous flow. But what made this advance so unusual was not just its speed, it was its shape. Instead of forming a single, solid front line, American forces spread out across multiple directions, creating gaps between units. Their goal was not to capture every town along the way, but to move past resistance whenever possible, cutting deeper into Germany's interior. Strong points were bypassed. Pockets of German troops were left behind, isolated and unable to communicate with higher command. For German soldiers on the ground, this created confusion. Orders became unclear. One unit might be told to hold a position, while another nearby had already begun retreating. Communication lines were broken or overwhelmed. In many cases, officers simply lost track of where the front line even was. Some units attempted to resist, setting up defensive positions in towns and along roads, but without coordination or sufficient supplies, these efforts rarely lasted long. American forces would either overwhelm them quickly or move around them entirely, leaving them surrounded. For civilians, this new phase of the war was deeply disorienting. There was no longer a clear sense of direction, no obvious front line to watch or listen for. One day, everything could seem unchanged. The next, distant sounds of engines and gunfire might echo from multiple directions at once. In some towns, German troops suddenly disappeared. Vehicles that had been stationed nearby were gone by morning, leaving behind empty streets and unanswered questions. Local officials continued their routines, unsure whether to stay or flee. Radios still broadcast official messages, but fewer people believed them. Then there were the moments that people would remember for the rest of their lives. An early morning, a quiet street, no warning. And then the sound of engines. American tanks appearing at the edge of town, moving cautiously but confidently. Soldiers scanning windows, watching for any sign of resistance. Sometimes there was none at all. No defense, no gunfire, just silence broken only by the mechanical rhythm of advancing vehicles. In many cases, these towns had not been fought over, they had been bypassed, then quietly surrounded. While the main force continued forward, smaller units closed in from different directions, cutting off roads and escape routes. By the time anyone realized what had happened, it was already too late. White flags began to appear more frequently now. Bed sheets, cloth, anything that could signal surrender was hung from windows or draped from balconies. It was not always organized or coordinated, often just individual families making a decision in the absence of clear authority. For American soldiers, these encounters varied. Some towns surrendered peacefully, their Sukan emerging cautiously, unsure of what to expect. Others saw brief bursts of resistance from isolated Seinik or young members of the Hitler Youth, driven by propaganda and fear. These clashes were usually short, but they added to the tension of an already uncertain situation. What made it all the more surreal was how quickly everything changed. A town that had been firmly under Nazi control the night before could find itself effectively under Allied control by morning without a major battle ever taking place. This was not the kind of war people had imagined. There were no clear beginnings or endings, no dramatic final stand in many places. Instead, it was a series of sudden transitions, moments where the familiar structure of authority simply dissolved. And behind it all was the relentless pace of the advance. Patton's forces did not stop unless they had to. Fuel shortages, damaged roads, and occasional resistance slowed them down, but never for long. The objective remained the same: keep moving, keep pushing, keep the enemy off balance. As this movement continued, its consequences began to grow. The pockets of isolated German forces became larger, more numerous. Entire regions were now cut off from the rest of the country, unable to receive orders or reinforcements. One of these regions in particular would soon become the focus of a massive encirclement, an industrial heartland filled with troops, equipment, and millions of civilians. And just like the towns that had been silently surrounded, it too would soon find itself cut off from the world beyond it. As American forces continued their rapid advance through Western Germany, the consequences of their strategy became impossible to ignore. What had begun as a fast-moving push was now turning into something much larger, an aggro encirclement that would trap one of the most important regions in the country. At the center of this was the Ruhr, the industrial heart of Germany. For decades, it had been the backbone of the nation's war production. Factories, steel mills, coal mines, and transport networks all concentrated in a relatively small area. It was also heavily populated, filled with both civilians and a large number of German Seinik units. By early April 1945, Allied forces had moved around this region from multiple directions. From the north and south, American and British units closed in, linking up and sealing off the area completely.
What remained inside became known as the Ruhr Pocket. Inside the pocket were over 300,000 German soldiers, along with millions of civilians. On paper, it looked like a force that could still resist, but the reality was very different. Communication had broken down almost entirely. Units inside the pocket could no longer coordinate effectively with each other, let alone with what remained of German high command. Supplies of ammunition, fuel, and food were rapidly diminishing. Aircraft attacks from Allied aircraft made movement during the day extremely dangerous, and even at night there was no guarantee of safety. The command structure itself began to collapse. Officers issued orders that could not be carried out or received no response at all. In some cases, local commanders simply stopped waiting for instructions and made their own decisions, whether to fight, withdraw, or surrender. Among the highest-ranking officers trapped inside was Walter Model, a respected commander known for his defensive skill. But even he could do little in this situation. The forces under his command were surrounded, fragmented, and increasingly unwilling to continue a fight that had no clear purpose. For the soldiers on the ground, the sense of the end was growing stronger with each passing day. Many had been fighting for years. Now, cut off and outmatched, they faced a choice that was becoming more and more inevitable. Some units attempted to break out of the encirclement, launching desperate attacks against Allied lines. These efforts almost always failed. The Allied Quwat were too strong, too well supplied, and too firmly positioned. Others chose a different path. Surrender began to happen not as a single event, but as a gradual, spreading phenomenon. Small groups of soldiers laid down their weapons and approached American lines, often carrying white cloths or raising their hands long before they came close. Then larger groups followed. Entire units began to dissolve, their structure disappearing as soldiers made individual decisions to stop fighting. For civilians inside the Ruhr Pocket, the experience was just as confusing and unsettling. The presence of so many German troops had once given a sense of protection, however fragile. Now those same troops were retreating, surrendering, or simply disappearing. Food shortages became more severe. Infrastructure, already damaged by bombing, continued to deteriorate. Local authorities struggled to maintain any kind of order, often unsure whether they still had any real power. At the same time, American forces were tightening their control over the pocket. Instead of launching costly direct assaults into heavily defended areas, they advanced carefully, dividing the region into smaller sections. Each move further reduced the ability of German forces to coordinate or resist. The sounds of war were constant but uneven. In some areas there was intense fighting, short, violent clashes as isolated units resisted. In others there was almost complete silence, broken only by the distant rumble of artillery or the Kosgaltkish noise of approaching vehicles. And then, suddenly, it would end. American troops entering a town, a brief moment of tension, and then surrender, sometimes immediate, sometimes after a few scattered shots. Soldiers disarmed, gathered, and led away in large numbers. The scale of it was unlike anything seen before. Lines of prisoners stretching along roads, guarded but often relieved that the fighting was over. For many German soldiers, surrender was no longer seen as dishonor, it was survival. As the days passed, the Ruhr Pocket continued to shrink. More units surrendered, more territory fell under Allied control. The giant force that had once been considered a key part of Germany's defense simply ceased to exist as an organized army. By mid-April, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The encirclement was complete, and the resistance within it had effectively collapsed. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers had been taken prisoner. One of the last major military formations in Western Germany was gone. For the towns inside the Ruhr, the war ended not with a single decisive battle, but through a process of gradual collapse. Authority faded, resistance dissolved, and control passed quietly, almost inevitably, into Allied hands. But beyond the Ruhr, the rapid advance continued, and in many places the pattern repeated itself. Towns that had not yet seen a single Allied soldier were suddenly cut off, isolated by the speed of the advance. No clear front line, no time to prepare. Only the growing realization that the war was no longer approaching, it was already there.
In the final weeks of the war, there was a pattern that repeated itself across Western Germany, quietly, almost invisibly. No dramatic announcements, no clear lines of front, no long battles stretching over days. Instead, something far more disorienting happened. Entire towns slipped from one reality into another in the span of a single night. Evening would fall as it always had. Streets would grow quiet, blackout curtains drawn across windows, families gathered inside their homes. Radios might still play official broadcasts, repeating messages of resistance and Ebishania of victory that few truly believed anymore. Local officials remained in place, uniforms still worn, rules still enforced. On the surface, the structure of the Nazi Germany still existed. And yet, just beyond that surface, everything had already begun to change. As Allied forces continued their advance, their strategy remained focused on speed and disruption. Rather than announcing their presence with large-scale assaults, they often moved around towns, cutting off roads and surrounding them from multiple directions. The goal was not always to fight, it was to isolate, to remove the possibility of organized resistance before it could even begin. For the civilians inside these towns, this movement was almost impossible to detect in real time. There were no clear signals, no official warnings. Perhaps distant artillery could be heard, or the faint sound of engines carried on the wind, but nothing that clearly said you are no longer connected to the rest of the country. And then, morning would come. At first, it might seem like any other day. A Privichny silence, maybe a few neighbors stepping outside, Ostorozhna looking around. But then, something felt different. The absence of German soldiers, the lack of movement on the roads leading out of town, a strange, heavy stillness. And then, the unmistakable sight. An M4 Sherman at the end of the street, another at the crossroads. American soldiers moving carefully between buildings, alert but controlled, watching for any sign of danger. Not rushing in chaos, but advancing with quiet confidence. In that moment, the illusion broke completely. There had been no battle, no defense, no last stand. The town had not been taken in the traditional sense. It had been okrugen, cut off from the outside world while everyone slept. Reactions varied from house to house. Some people stayed inside, afraid to move, unsure of what would happen next. Others acted quickly, hanging white cloths from windows, signaling surrender before a single word was spoken. For many, this decision had already been made days earlier. They had simply been waiting for the moment. American soldiers moved through these towns with caution. Every doorway, every window could still hide a threat. In some cases, there were brief flashes of resistance, isolated gunfire from soldiers or UVA members of the Hitler Youth, still clinging to the idea of fighting to the end. But these moments were usually korotki, quickly overwhelmed or abandoned. More often, there was only silence. Soldiers knocking on doors, gesturing for civilians to come out, instructions given in simple words or hand signals, weapons collected, positions secured. The process was methodical, almost routine, repeated again and again in town after town. For civilians, the emotional shift was immediate and overwhelming. Fear was still there, fear of the unknown, of occupation, of what these foreign soldiers might do. But alongside it came something else, relief. The persistent stress of air raids, of uncertainty, of living under a collapsing regime. Suddenly, it was over. In many places, people described the same ощущение.
It did not feel like a Победа or a Поражение. It felt like waking up from something. Children, often less bound by fear, were sometimes the first to approach the soldiers, curious and cautious at the same time. Adults followed more slowly, watching, trying to understand this new reality unfolding in front of them. The symbols of the old order disappeared quickly. Flags were taken down, uniforms were hidden or discarded. Officials who had once enforced strict control either vanished or attempted to blend back into the civilian population. Authority, which had once seemed absolute, dissolved almost instantly. And what replaced it was not chaos, but a different kind of order. American units established control, setting rules, organizing supplies, and ensuring that resistance would not reemerge. The transition, while sudden, was often calmer than anyone had expected. The Jang, which had consumed years of life, ended in these places not with a final explosion, but with a quiet smiana vlasti. What made these moments so powerful was their simplicity. No warning, no preparation, just the realization in the early light of morning that everything had changed. Across Germany, this scene repeated itself dozens, even hundreds of times. Towns waking up surrounded, people stepping outside into a world that no longer belonged to the regime they had lived under for years. By the time the larger events of the war reached their conclusion, by the time the fall of Berlin brought the final collapse of Nazi rule, for many ordinary people, the war had already ended in this quiet, almost surreal way. Not with a final battle, but with a morning.